The crystal chandeliers of the Capitol Eagle cast prismatic rainbows across mahogany walls adorned with portraits of America's founding fathers. Kash Patel stood before a gilded frame containing Thomas Jefferson's weathered visage, his fingers tracing the inscription beneath, "We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal." The irony wasn't lost on him. Here he was, a son of Indian immigrants, standing in one of Washington's most exclusive sanctuaries, surrounded by the very people who controlled the levers of American power. The evening's gathering buzzed with the low murmur of political intrigue. Senators whispered to defense contractors, tech moguls exchanged knowing glances with congressional committee chairs, and lobbyists circulated like sharks sensing opportunity. Through the floor-to-ceiling windows, the Potomac reflected the amber glow of streetlights, while beyond, the Capitol dome stood sentinel over the sleeping city. "Quite the collection, isn't it?" Senator Margaret Thornfield approached, her voice carrying the refined cadence of old New England money. "Though I sometimes wonder what they'd think of our modern interpretation of their vision." Patel turned, offering a diplomatic smile. "I imagine they'd be fascinated by how far we've traveled from their original blueprint. Though whether they'd approve." He gestured toward the window, where protesters had gathered earlier that day, their distant voices still echoing in memory. Their conversation was interrupted by a commotion outside. Through the windows, they watched as a silver Tesla Cybertruck, an angular monument to futuristic design, pulled directly onto the circular driveway, bypassing the designated parking area entirely. Camera flashes erupted from the small crowd of journalists who'd been waiting like patient vultures. "Showtime," Senator Thornfield muttered, though her tone carried more amusement than annoyance. The room's energy shifted palpably as conversations paused and heads turned toward the entrance. Elon Musk strode through the double doors with the confidence of a man accustomed to bending reality to his will. His presence filled the space like an electromagnetic field. Some were drawn to his orbit, others instinctively stepped back. He wore a simple black jacket over dark jeans, a studied casualness that somehow made his wealth more pronounced rather than concealed. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced to no one in particular, his South African accent lending an exotic edge to his words, "I apologize for the dramatic entrance. Traffic was absolutely criminal, and I thought, why not test the Cybertruck's ability to navigate Washington's bureaucratic obstacles?" The room erupted in polite laughter, though Patel noticed how some chuckles seemed more forced than others. He watched as the tech magnate worked the room with practiced ease, switching between languages of influence, speaking venture capital with the entrepreneurs, regulatory compliance with the politicians, and visionary futures with the dreamers. "Kash." Musk's voice cut across the room as his attention landed on Patel. The man who actually understands how government contracts should work. Unlike some of the fossils in this room who think innovation means upgrading from fax machines to email. More laughter, sharper this time. Patel felt the subtle shift in the room's dynamics, the way conversations quieted, how people angled their bodies to better observe what would unfold next. "Mr. Musk," Patel replied, his tone measured. "Always a pleasure. Though I'd argue that understanding contracts and executing them fairly are two different skills entirely." "Fair?" Musk's eyebrows arched theatrically. "That's an interesting concept when we're talking about pushing humanity toward a multiplanetary future. Should we handicap innovation in the name of fairness? Should we give equal consideration to companies that promise the moon but deliver paperweights?" The conversation around them had ceased entirely now. Even the servers had slowed their circulation, sensing the electric tension building between the two men. "No one's suggesting we handicap innovation," Patel responded, his voice carrying the calm authority he had honed during years in government service. "But when taxpayer dollars are involved, the process should be transparent. When SpaceX wins a contract, it should be because you're genuinely the best option, not because you have the best lobbyists or the most Twitter followers." "Twitter followers?" Musk laughed, but there was a harder edge now. "I think you mean results. While bureaucrats debate process, I'm actually building the infrastructure for humanity's survival. But I suppose that's the difference between doers and, well, commentators." Patel felt the familiar heat rising in his chest, the same feeling he had experienced in countless congressional hearings when faced with condescension disguised as wit. Commentary has its place, especially when it prevents public resources from flowing to private interests without proper oversight. Proper oversight, Musk repeated, his voice dripping with disdain. You know what proper oversight got us? A space program that couldn't put an American astronaut into orbit without Russian rockets. Meanwhile, private enterprise, my enterprise, restored American space dominance in less than a decade. The circle of observers had grown larger, forming a loose amphitheater around the two men. Senator Thornfield caught Patel's eye and gave an almost imperceptible shake of her head, a warning to de-escalate. But something in Musk's tone, in his easy assumption of superiority, triggered a deeper response. Your enterprise succeeded because it built upon 60 years of taxpayer-funded research and development, Patel countered. NASA didn't just hand you the keys to space, they paved the road you're driving on. And now I'm improving that road, Musk shot back. The difference between us, Kash, is that I understand the future requires risk-takers, not risk managers. It requires people willing to bet everything on breakthrough technologies, not bureaucrats who think progress should be democratic committee decisions. The words hung in the air like a challenge. Around them, the Washington elite watched with the fascination of spectators at a gladiatorial contest. This was the kind of intellectual combat that thrilled them, the clash of titans they'd come to witness. Risk-taking is admirable, Patel said, his voice growing stronger. But so is accountability. And so is remembering that American innovation has always been built on contributions from every corner of this nation and beyond. Some of our greatest technological leaps came from immigrants who arrived with nothing but their minds and their determination. Ah, now we're getting to it, Musk's smile was sharp as a blade. The immigration lecture. Tell me, who's contributed more to American technological supremacy, the immigrants who built companies that employ hundreds of thousands, or the ones who lecture about fairness from government sinecures? The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Several people exchanged uncomfortable glances. This had moved beyond policy disagreement into personal territory, and everyone could feel it. That's an interesting question, Patel replied, his voice dangerously quiet. Especially coming from someone who seems to have forgotten that America's strength has never been about individual genius, but about creating systems that allow all forms of genius to flourish. Systems? Musk's laugh was harsh now. Systems are what protect mediocrity. Systems are what ensure that breakthrough innovations get buried under committees and compliance requirements. Some of us don't have time for systems, we're too busy actually building the future. And some of us believe the future should belong to everyone, not just those with the deepest pockets or the loudest voices. Musk's face flushed red. The careful mask of controlled charisma slipped, revealing something raw underneath. The room held its collective breath. You know what? Musk's voice rose above the genteel murmur that had served as background noise all evening. I'm tired of being lectured about American values by people who, he stopped himself, visibly struggling with some internal governor. By people who what? Patel's voice was steel wrapped in silk. The moment stretched like a rubber band at its breaking point. Musk's hands clenched at his sides. His breathing grew shallow. The careful choreography of elite discourse was crumbling before their eyes. By people who should sit down or get out and go back to your poor country. The words exploded across the room like a sonic boom. Conversations died mid-sentence. Glasses stopped halfway to lips. Even the grandfather clock in the corner seemed to pause its ancient rhythm. Musk's face went white as he realized what had just said. His hand moved instinctively toward his pocket, where his phone was already vibrating with notifications someone had been recording. Patel stood motionless for a long moment, his dark eyes never leaving Musk's face. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the quiet power of controlled fury. Gentlemen and ladies, he said, addressing the room without looking away from Musk. I believe we've just witnessed a perfect demonstration of why character matters as much as capital in the American experiment. The silence that followed was deafening. In his pocket, Musk's phone continued its urgent buzzing, the sound of a reputation beginning to crumble in real time. The silence stretched like a taut wire across the opulent room. 80 of Washington's most powerful individuals stood frozen in a tableau of shock, their champagne flutes suspended in midair, their conversations severed as cleanly as if someone had pulled the plug on reality itself. The grandfather clock's pendulum seemed to swing in slow motion,
marking seconds that felt like hours.
Kash Patel remained perfectly still, his hands clasped behind his back, his gaze never wavering from Elon Musk's increasingly pale face. The tech mogul's eyes darted around the room like a trapped animal seeking escape, finally settling on his phone, which continued its relentless buzzing. The device had become a ticking time bomb in his pocket, each vibration a reminder that his words were already racing across fiber optic cables, bouncing off satellites, spreading through the digital ecosystem he had helped create. Elon, perhaps we should, as Senator Thornfield began, her diplomatic instincts kicking in, but Patel raised a gentle hand that somehow commanded absolute attention. No, he said quietly, his voice carrying across the marble floors with crystalline clarity. Let's not rush to smooth this over. Mr. Musk has given us a gift tonight, a moment of perfect honesty. It would be discourteous not to examine it properly. Musk's jaw tightened. I didn't mean, the words came out wrong. You know I respect, stop. Patel's voice remained calm, but it carried an authority that made even a billionaire pause mid-sentence. Please don't insult our intelligence with backpedaling. You said exactly what you meant to say. The only question now is whether you understand what you've revealed. The young tech entrepreneur standing near the windows, probably worth $50 million before his 30th birthday, shifted uncomfortably. The defense contractor who'd been courting senators all evening suddenly found his Italian leather shoes fascinating. Even the servers had retreated to the edges of the room, sensing they were witnessing something that would be dissected in boardrooms and op-ed columns for weeks to come. Patel began to walk slowly around the room's perimeter, his movement deliberate and measured, like a professor preparing to deliver a lecture that would change everything his students thought they knew. You asked about poor countries, Mr. Musk. Let's explore that concept, shall we? His voice took on the cadence of someone who had spent years in classrooms before entering the halls of power. India, my family's homeland, gave the world the concept of zero. Without which, incidentally, your computers wouldn't function. Indian mathematicians developed decimal notation, calculated the Earth's circumference, and pioneered surgical techniques when Europe was still convinced that bathing caused disease. He paused before a portrait of Benjamin Franklin, the polymath's knowing smile seeming to encourage the discourse. Aryabhata calculated the value of pi to 4 decimal places in the 5th century. Brahmagupta established the mathematical rules for working with negative numbers. Sushruta performed cataract surgery 2,000 years before Western medicine attempted it. Patel's voice grew stronger, more resonant. Poor country, you said? Musk opened his mouth to speak, but Patel continued his measured circuit of the room. But let's move closer to home, shall we? Let's talk about what happened when people from this poor country encountered American opportunity. He gestured toward the assembled crowd. The CEO of Google. Indian American. Microsoft. Indian American. Adobe, MasterCard, IBM, shall I continue? The crowd was no longer pretending to have side conversations. Every eye was fixed on Patel, every ear attuned to his words. This wasn't just a response to an insult, it was becoming something larger, more significant. But here's what's truly remarkable, Patel continued, his tone shifting from professorial to something more personal, more passionate. These weren't conquests. These weren't takeovers. These were partnerships. Americans created a system so powerful, so fundamentally sound, that it could take minds from anywhere in the world and unleash their potential. That's not weakness, Mr. Musk, that's the greatest strength a civilization has ever possessed. He stopped directly in front of the tech magnate, who seemed to have shrunk several inches during the discourse. America didn't become great because it excluded people like my parents. It became great because it included them. Because it said, bring us your hunger, your genius, your different perspectives, and let's build something unprecedented together. Young Congresswoman Elena Vasquez, who had been quietly observing from the corner, found herself nodding involuntarily. The venture capitalist near the bar set down his drink, completely absorbed. Even Senator Thornfield, who had seen decades of political theater, recognized she was witnessing something extraordinary. Now, Patel said, his voice taking on a different quality, sharper, more pointed, let's discuss your homeland, Mr. Musk. South Africa during apartheid.
What exactly did that system teach the world about human potential? About equality? About the wisdom of judging people by their origins rather than their contributions? Musk's face flushed crimson. That's not, you can't compare, can I? Patel's eyebrows rose with genuine curiosity. A system that decided some people were inherently worth more than others based on accidents of birth? A system that wasted human talent because it didn't fit predetermined categories? Tell me, how is that different from suggesting that someone should go back to their poor country because they have the audacity to question your methods? The room had become a crucible of tension. Several attendees were now openly recording with their phones, recognizing they were witnessing a moment that would be analyzed and debated long after the evening ended. Musk straightened, trying to reclaim some dignity. I've built companies that employ hundreds of thousands of people. I've advanced human space exploration by decades. I've accelerated the transition to sustainable energy. My results speak for themselves.
Your results, Patel acknowledged with a slight nod.
Impressive indeed.
Built on government contracts, taxpayer-funded research, public infrastructure, and let's not forget the brilliant minds of engineers and scientists from dozens of countries, including many from the poor ones you seem so quick to dismiss. The grandfather clock chimed 9 times, each note reverberating through the charged atmosphere. But here's what troubles me most about your outburst, Patel continued, his voice growing softer but somehow more penetrating.
It reveals a fundamental misunderstanding of what America actually is.
You seem to believe that wealth or technological achievement grants you the authority to determine who belongs here. That success gives you the right to decide who deserves a seat at the table. He gestured toward the portraits lining the walls: Washington, Jefferson, Adams, Lincoln. These men understood something you seem to have forgotten. They knew that the moment you start deciding who's American enough, who's worthy enough, who's contributed enough, you've begun to destroy the very thing that made America worth belonging to in the first place. The defense contractor who'd been avoiding eye contact suddenly looked up, his expression thoughtful. The young tech entrepreneur stepped forward slightly, as if drawn by gravity. Even the servers had crept closer, abandoning any pretense of work. Musk's phone had stopped buzzing, either the battery had died or the initial wave of viral sharing had crested. In the sudden silence, his voice seemed smaller, more uncertain.
I spoke in anger.
But surely you understand the frustration of trying to move society forward while dealing with endless bureaucratic obstacles, endless criticism from people who've never built anything, never risked everything on an impossible dream. Patel studied him for a long moment, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a note of something that might have been sympathy.
I do understand frustration, Mr. Musk.
I understand what it feels like to be questioned, to have your motives dissected, to feel like you're fighting uphill battles against systems that seem designed to slow you down. He paused, his gaze steady.
But that frustration doesn't give us license to forget our humanity. It doesn't excuse cruelty.
And it certainly doesn't justify telling another human being that they don't belong in the country they've sworn to serve.
The silence that followed was different from before, less shocked, more contemplative.
It was the silence of minds working, of assumptions being examined, of comfortable certainties being questioned. Finally, impossibly, Elon Musk began to clap. Slowly at first, then with gathering conviction, his hands came together in measured applause. The sound echoed through the room like gunshots, startling everyone, most of all Patel himself.
Bravo, Musk said, his voice carrying a complex mixture of emotions: chagrin, respect, and something that might have been relief. Absolutely brilliant. Educational. Humbling.
He paused, his clapping slowing to a stop.
But you forgot one crucial detail in your comprehensive destruction of my character. The room held its collective breath once again, wondering what twist this extraordinary evening could possibly have left to offer. Musk's lips curved into a smile that was equal parts admiration and challenge. You forgot to tell them what happens next.
The sound of Elon Musk's applause still echoed through the Capitol Eagle's hallowed chambers as he stepped forward, his earlier fury transformed into something more complex, a mixture of genuine admiration and intellectual hunger that seemed to energize him like electricity. What happens next, he repeated, his voice carrying a new quality that commanded attention in an entirely different way than his earlier outburst had.
You've given us a masterclass in American history, Kash. Brilliant, passionate, completely accurate.
But you've described the America that was, the America that welcomed your parents and mine.
The question that keeps me awake at night is, what should America become?
The room's atmosphere shifted again, as if the air itself had changed frequency. The hostile tension of moments before evolved into something more electric, more intellectually charged. Senator Thornfield leaned forward, recognizing that the evening had transformed from scandal to symposium.
Patel studied Musk carefully, sensing the shift but not yet trusting it. "I'm listening."
First, Musk said, his hands moving as he spoke, painting invisible equations in the air, "I owe you an apology. Not the political kind that my handlers will craft for the morning shows, but a real one. What I said was wrong, not just tactically stupid, but fundamentally wrong. It contradicted everything I claimed to believe about human potential."
The admission sent ripples through the crowd. Venture capitalist Rebecca Chang nearly dropped her wine glass. The young tech entrepreneur from earlier actually gasped audibly.
In Washington, genuine apologies were rarer than lunar eclipses and usually just as spectacular. But, Musk continued, his momentum building, my anger came from a real place, even if my expression of it was inexcusable. I'm frustrated because I see America losing its edge, becoming comfortable with mediocrity, drowning in process while other nations sprint ahead in artificial intelligence, quantum computing, bioengineering.
While we debate the ethics of genetic enhancement, China is quietly engineering tomorrow's humans.
Patel's eyes sharpened.
So your solution is to abandon the principles that made America worth defending in the first place?
No, Musk replied quickly, my solution is to evolve them. The founders you referenced so eloquently, they were revolutionaries, Kash. They threw out centuries of established governance to create something unprecedented.
They believed in the radical idea that ordinary people could govern themselves.
But they also created institutions designed to adapt, to grow, to meet challenges they couldn't even imagine. He gestured toward the portrait of Alexander Hamilton.
Hamilton understood that America needed to be more than just idealistic, it needed to be competitively excellent. He built financial systems that could go toe-to-toe with any European power.
He believed in meritocracy backed by robust institutions.
Young Congresswoman Elena Vasquez stepped forward from her corner, unable to remain silent. "Mr. Musk, are you suggesting that our current democratic processes are somehow incompatible with excellence?"
Musk turned to her with evident respect.
"Congresswoman, I'm suggesting that democracy and meritocracy aren't opposites, they're partners. But we've let bureaucratic thinking infect both. We've confused fairness of process with fairness of outcome. We've made it harder to be exceptional than to be average." The defense contractor, Dr. William Harrison, finally found his voice. "But who determines what exceptional means? Your companies? The market? The government?"
"All of them," Musk replied without hesitation.
"Competition between systems, between ideas, between approaches. Let NASA compete with SpaceX.
Let public universities compete with private ones.
Let different states try different policies.
But measure the results ruthlessly, and scale up what works."
Patel walked to the window, gazing out at the Potomac while processing this unexpected philosophical turn. "You're describing a system where efficiency matters more than equity."
"I'm describing a system where equity includes the right to excel," Musk countered. "Where we don't artificially limit anyone's potential, whether they come from Palo Alto or Punjab, Detroit or Delhi.
But where we also don't pretend that all outcomes should be identical regardless of effort, innovation, or contribution."
Senator Thornfield cleared her throat. "Gentlemen, this is fascinating, but we're dancing around some fundamental questions about power and who gets to make these decisions."
"Exactly." Musk's eyes lit up. "That's precisely the question."
In the founders' era, the elite were people who could read Latin and own land.
Today, should the elite be people who can code quantum algorithms and engineer biological systems? Should governance require technical literacy? The room erupted in murmurs.
This was no longer about immigration or insults, it had become a debate about the future of democratic governance itself.
Patel turned back from the window, his expression thoughtful. You're advocating for technocracy. I'm advocating for competency, Musk replied. When your child needs surgery, do you want the most democratically selected surgeon, or the most skilled one? When we're designing systems that will affect billions of lives, shouldn't expertise matter? But expertise in what? Patel's voice carried a new intensity. Technical knowledge? Understanding markets? Or understanding people, their needs, their dreams, their fears?
The farmer in Iowa who can't code may understand soil and weather patterns better than any algorithm.
The teacher in Detroit may understand human development better than any neuroscientist. Rebecca Chang stepped forward, her venture capitalist instincts engaged. Could we create systems that value both kinds of knowledge? Technical excellence and human wisdom?
Switzerland, Dr. Harrison said suddenly. They've maintained prosperity and innovation while preserving democratic participation through their referendum system.
Citizens vote directly on complex policy issues, but only after extensive public education campaigns. Estonia, added the young tech entrepreneur, finally finding his courage. They've digitized government services while maintaining democratic accountability. Citizens can vote online, access all government services digitally, but transparency requirements mean everything is auditable. Musk nodded enthusiastically. Exactly. We don't have to choose between democracy and efficiency. We can engineer better democracy. Patel found himself reluctantly intrigued despite his wariness. But who does the engineering? Who writes the algorithms that govern the algorithms? Who watches the watchers?
All of us, Congresswoman Vasquez interjected with surprising passion.
What if citizenship in the 21st century meant more than just voting every few years? What if it meant ongoing participation in governance, continuous education about complex issues, real engagement with the machinery of democracy?
The conversation was gaining momentum, pulling in voices from around the room. The Pakistani-American AI researcher who'd been silent all evening spoke up. In Pakistan, we have a saying, the tree that bears fruit gets pelted with stones.
America has always been the tree that bears fruit.
The question is whether we respond to the stone throwers by hiding our fruit or by growing stronger branches. Beautiful metaphor, Musk acknowledged.
And it brings us back to the core question, how do we grow stronger branches? Patel considered this, his earlier anger transforming into genuine intellectual engagement.
Perhaps the answer isn't choosing between competing visions, but creating space for multiple experiments.
What if different states, different cities, could try different approaches to governance, to education, to innovation? Real laboratories of democracy?
Constitutional framework with local innovation, Senator Thornfield mused.
Federal protection of fundamental rights, but maximum flexibility in implementation. Silicon Valley could experiment with digital democracy, Rebecca Chang added. Detroit could focus on industrial revitalization.
Each community defining excellence in their own terms, but sharing lessons across the network.
The grandfather clock chimed 10 times, but no one seemed to notice.
The conversation had taken on a life of its own, pulling together threads from political theory, technological possibility, and practical governance. Musk pulled out his phone, the same device that had been buzzing with notifications about his earlier outburst, and held it up.
This conversation is already going viral.
Not the insult, not the controversy, but this, the actual engagement with ideas. People are hungry for serious discussion about serious questions.
Patel looked around the room at faces that had transformed from shocked observers to engaged participants. Maybe that's the real American innovation we need.
Not just new technologies or new policies, but new ways of talking to each other across our differences. A national conversation worthy of the challenges we face, Congresswoman Vasquez added. Where we assume good faith, engage with complexity, and focus on solving problems rather than scoring points.
Musk extended his hand to Patel.
I may have started this evening as your adversary, but I'd like to end it as your collaborator. Not because we agree on everything, but because we both care enough to argue about the things that matter. Patel looked at the extended hand, Then at the faces around the room, people from different backgrounds, different ideologies, different generations, all united by a sudden recognition that they might actually be able to work together on something important.
He shook Musk's hand firmly. Collaboration doesn't mean compromising our principles.
It means applying them to real challenges. Through the windows, the Capitol dome gleamed in the distance, its light reflecting off the Potomac like a beacon, calling them to remember what was possible when Americans chose to build together rather than tear apart. The evening that had begun with insult and division was ending with something rarer and more precious: hope that the American experiment might still have room to grow.